Hello and welcome to Forward Boldly. I'm Christine Niles. For those keeping abreast of things happening in China, you know that the communist government is ramping up its digital gulag, increasing its oppressive control over the Chinese people, expanding its social credit system, which it uses to control the population, also expanding Skynet, its vast network of cameras used to spy on citizens. It truly is a big brother society, and it's hoping to export that sort of oppressive control here in the U.S., and we've got politicians here who are more than happy to implement those measures. And for those familiar with my background, you know that my family was directly affected by communism. I was born in Saigon, Vietnam. A year before it fell to the communists, my family essentially had to flee the country. Many of my relatives became boat people and refugees because of the communist takeover in Vietnam. So I have firsthand experience with communism and its effects. Today, I'm honored to have with me Stephen Mosher. He's a foremost expert on China, having spent time there and extensively studied its history and culture. He has testified numerous times before Congress as an expert on world population and human rights abuses. And he's out with a new book published by Tan Books titled The Devil and Communist China. Mr. Mosher, it is wonderful to have you on the show. Welcome.
It's good to be with you here.
So you've got this new book out, and you begin your book with a quote by Mao Zedong. He said, "Morality begins at the point of a gun." And you have called Mao the killingest man in history. So could you please tell us, for our audience who may not be familiar with the scope of slaughter in communist China, what did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by that is that Mao, who was a uniquely evil individual, I must say, having spent a year reading all of his works and immersing myself in the minds of this evil genius. At the end of each day of writing, I had to read the Catechism or the Bible and then go take a shower so that I'd feel clean again. He was a totally immoral individual who had absolute disdain for the life of others. I don't believe he ever loved another person, perhaps aside from his mother, in his entire life. He betrayed colleagues. He betrayed his serial wives. He betrayed the 1,000 young women he bedded in an effort to achieve immortality. He betrayed the Chinese people over and over and over again. And if there was ever a statement that makes clear his attitude towards the world and the people in it, as a young man, he wrote, "There are other people and things in the world," he said, "but they only exist for my use and my pleasure." Sounding for all the world as if he's some kind of demigod come down from Mount Olympus to play on the human chessboard and move the pieces around where he will and knock them over if he decides that they're no longer useful to him. He treated the Chinese people as a kind of renewable resource that he could dispose of in any way he chose. And of course, he preached a philosophy, communism, based on hatred. And hatred, is the fuel that drives the Communist Party forward even today. It has to have a target. It has to identify and isolate and terrorize and kill segments of the population, maybe the Falun Gong, maybe the Uyghurs, maybe the Catholics now in China, but it always has to have an enemy to maintain the muscular rigor of the system and to maintain the hate-fueled energy of the whole system. So Mao, in the Civil War, he killed millions of Chinese. During the latter stages of the Civil War, he was surrounding cities and refusing to let any civilians out or any food in. And, 1 million people died in the city of Shenyang up in Manchuria as a result. During the early years of the Chinese Communist Party's takeover of China, the killing continued with purges of businessmen, anyone associated with the nationalist regime, anyone who was declared to be a rich peasant or a landlord. They were terrorized, they were tortured, many of them were simply taken out and shot. The killing increased during the Great Leap Forward when many peasants resisted going into communes because they didn't want to give up their land. Well, they were forced into communes anyway, and many of the families were destroyed. The men were forced into dormitories for men, and the women were forced into dormitories for women, and the children were raised in state-run nurseries, educated by the state. About 45 million people starved to death as a result of the communist um, commune system from 1959 to 1962 or thereabouts. Nearly 50 million people died at Mao's hand, basically. And he was totally indifferent to it, totally indifferent to it. He said at one point, he said, deaths have benefits, he said. Deaths have benefits. They fertilize the soil. Well, thinking of human beings as nothing more than potential compost is I think shows you everything you need to know about this man who was basically soulless, without a conscience. And he would say that if you ask him, he would admit to being lawless and godless. He rejected the idea of a God. Of course, communism is based on the rejection of the idea of God. And he was lawless. He was a law unto himself. And at the end of the day, I ascribe 100 million deaths to him in China, from famine, from purges, persecutions, a cultural revolution, the Civil War deaths, unnecessary. And then, of course, there's the one-child policy, and you think, okay, well, the one-child policy didn't begin until 1980, and Mao died several years before, so how can he be responsible? Well, he's responsible in this sense. He's responsible because in 1958, he gave a speech to the senior leaders of the Communist Party, and he said, just as we control the production of bicycles and the number of tons of steel at our steel factories, we need to control reproduction. We need to set up a department of family planning, a department of birth control, to decide every year how many babies we're going to produce in the country. And he argued that's what China needed. Well, 22 years later, the people who followed him in power, Deng Xiaoping and the successors, acted on that belief, acted on the belief that the state had the right to control reproduction in the same way that it controlled production. And 400 babies died as a result of the one-child policy from 1980 to 2016, when it finally ended. I was in the operating room when they were doing cesarean section abortions on women who were 7, 8, and 9 months pregnant. Babies at that stage of gestation, of course, are quite capable of surviving outside the womb. You feed them, you keep them warm, they're fine. Well, they didn't survive the one-child policy. So Mao Zedong, the killingest man in human history, I apologize for the grammar, but that conveys the idea that I wanted to convey. The killingest man in human history was, I believe, responsible for 500 million deaths. That's 500 million people. And he put in place the biggest killing machine in human history, the Chinese Communist Party.
You know, you mentioned the one-child policy, and of course, you know, in recent years they've relaxed it because they're realizing the disastrous consequences of implementing that sort of population control. But, you know, you have a very interesting background because you were the first social scientist allowed onto mainland China after they implemented the one-child policy. You mentioned that you were in the operating room, you witnessed these horrors firsthand. And at the time, you were a pro-abortion atheist, and you've said that just witnessing these evils was actually what kickstarted your way kind of back to belief.
Well, it did, because, you know, many people who graduate from especially our elite universities, graduate with the idea that absolute evil doesn't exist. They believe, because they've been taught, that everything is situational. Ethics are situational. How you behave depends on the situation. Morals are relative. There are no moral absolutes. They reject God, they reject the Ten Commandments, and that's really where I was. And it took the experience of being exposed to an absolute evil act to convince me of the existence of evil. And the absolute evil act was the killing of an innocent, unborn human being, in some cases, you know, only days or hours before birth, an innocent human being who'd done nothing to deserve the death sentence at all, a tiny son of Adam, a tiny daughter of Eve, who had been conceived 8 or 9 months before, when it was legal to have a second or a third or fourth child. And now all of a sudden their life was being taken from them. And I saw the destruction of innocent human life, and it was as if the pit of hell opened up before me. because I realized for the first time the utter darkness and evil that human beings were capable of. And I realized that if such a great evil could exist, from which I recoiled in horror, a compensating good had to exist. Because if there was no compensating good, then the universe was an insane asylum, and I didn't want to live in a madhouse. So I began recoiling from the evil. I began to seek the good, and if you seek the good, you'll be led to God, who is the source of all goodness. And that's what happened in my case. I saw I became pro-life in that operating room. I began to defend the sanctity of human life, and I also began to speak at pro-life conferences, and I discovered that unlike the rather self-absorbed, arrogant, not to say snobby people, professors at Stanford University, these were ordinary people, loving, kind, ordinary people, and engaged in a struggle for which they would receive no earthly reward, perhaps only a heavenly one. And I wanted to be like them. So gradually I came in the direction of seeking the good, found God, found my way into the Catholic Church, and here I am today.
That's amazing. And also, you've devoted your life to helping the suffering throughout the world, obviously the unborn, but also bringing light to the people in China. Let's talk about modern day China now. You know, the world suffered through COVID, but I think no one suffered more than the Chinese. And it's clear the communist government used it as an excuse to massively increase its power, locking up millions in high rises, in some cases literally padlocking them inside their apartments. We saw footage of one high rise catching on fire and the people couldn't escape. And then there were even horror stories of elderly people infected with COVID being sent still alive to crematoriums. I mean, do we have any idea of the scale of deaths that happened in China? I mean, not just as a result of COVID, but as a result of the CCP's lockdown measures during the pandemic.
Well, first of all, we know the Chinese Communist Party lies about everything. They lie about the number of tons of steel they produce every year. They lie about the size of the economy. They lie about corruption. They lie about their population. They exaggerate the numbers of people in China. China's population is in absolute decline. And they lied about the number of deaths in China under COVID. I mean, the numbers they were producing in the early days of Wuhan, a few dozen people, was just nonsense, because we know that there were a dozen crematoria in and around Wuhan. And we know that each of those crematoria had a couple dozen ovens. And those crematoria, the furnaces in those crematoria were going day and night. The smokestacks were black with smoke all the time as they were burning, cremating multiple bodies at the same time. They were hiring extra people to bring in the dead bodies. They were so overwhelmed with the number of people who were dying. So the numbers were huge. This was a bioweapon, without a doubt. It was developed in conjunction with the People's Liberation Army, which was using the Wuhan Institute of Virology as one of the labs that it is collaborating with.
I hope you're enjoying the show. No, this is not the part where I tell you the rest of the show is behind the paywall. In fact, I'm hoping to make all my episodes free. If you haven't signed up for our email, please do so by visiting stellamaris.media and signing up. I've got a number of projects I'm excited about at Stella Maris Media, but we are entirely self-funded. So if you are able to give, go to stellamaris.media and click on Support Our Work. Thanks so much for watching, and back to the show.
They were using techniques that they learned in the United States at the University of North Carolina's lab, Ralph Barrick's lab at the University of North Carolina, where the Chinese virologist, Dr. Shizheng Li, had studied and learned from Dr. Ralph Barrick how to snip and glue segments of a genome together, a coronavirus genome together, to create a virus that was more infectious and more deadly. And that's exactly what the PLA did. And then when they let it out, I think, in my view, it became a kind of civil defense exercise. The Chinese government was eager to see exactly how much control in a totalitarian manner it could exert over the population. And so it was locking people in their homes. One of the most haunting pictures I remember from that time was when they locked down the entire city of Shanghai, 25 million people. And one gentleman who was living in an apartment, up the 15th floor of a high-rise apartment building, pushed his refrigerator out on the balcony with the doors open in a kind of a silent scream saying, I'm starving to death. My refrigerator is empty. They won't let me out of my apartment. Many people died in their apartments. They died from lack of food. They died from lack of medicine. I mean, if you're elderly and you require, a prescription now and again, those prescriptions were not forthcoming. So the death toll, I believe, was huge. But I said civil defense, and I mean that seriously. They are constantly, a communist party is a war party, and it is constantly seeking ways to keep the population under control, to keep it isolated in individual cells of fear, to prevent people from talking ill of the regime and perhaps organizing resistance to it. And what better way than to lock everybody in their apartments on the pretext that if they went out in the street, they'd get a deadly disease and die. So I think it was kind of a civil defense exercise too, to see exactly how much control they could exert over the population in the event perhaps of another war, a war in the Korean Peninsula, a war in the South China Sea, or most likely, an invasion of Taiwan. They want to see exactly how much control they have over the Chinese people. Can they lock you in your apartment until you die? Well, a lot of people were locked in their apartments, and a lot of people did die.
Just tragic. We have a mutual friend, Reggie Littlejohn, who's president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers, and she has also spoken out a great deal about what's going on in China. And one of the things she's been talking about lately is China's digital gulag, the social credit system. And I recently reported on how communist officials are literally going door to door, installing QR codes above people's doorways so that their neighbors can scan the QR codes to find out their neighbors' social credit scores. And of course, as we know, the government controls the social credit scores. They can deduct points from your score if you criticize the government. Could you talk a little bit about this regime under Xi, this regime of control, and some of the oppressive control measures that he's taking now?
Well, Xi, like every totalitarian before him, and especially Mao Zedong, who was his model in all things. Mao is clearly the model for Xi Jinping's behavior. Xi is not the son of his loins, but he's the son of his kind of evil spirit, because he has studied Mao's career and he emulates Mao in all things. And Mao always aspired to have total control over the population, but was limited by technology in the amount of degree of control he could exercise. I remember when I first arrived in my commune in 1979, there were loudspeakers in every corner, and those loudspeakers were blaring 16 hours a day. They'd start early in the morning when you were supposed to be up and working in the common fields, and they'd go on until late at night, and they finally went off about 10 p.m. And they were rebroadcasts of over and over and over again of the speeches of Chairman Mao and Hua Guofeng and other people. Constant propaganda. Trying to do what? Trying to brainwash the people into compliance. During the commune era, he actually toyed with the idea, Mao did, of removing names from the Chinese people and just giving them numbers, turning the whole country into a giant prison camp where, as in Les Miserables, right? Who, when Jean Valjean has, 24601, he has a number, he doesn't have a name. Well, Mao wanted to give all the villagers in China numbers to keep track of them better. Well, Xi Jinping, now 40 years later, is able to act on those aspirations. And he's acting on them in several ways. One way is he's got more video surveillance cameras in Chinese cities than the rest of the world combined. They're everywhere in China, and they're tracking people. He's also stolen the face recognition technology from American companies. That happened, 20 years ago now. And so those video surveillance cameras can identify who is walking down the street quite easily. And artificial intelligence, which Google and other American companies have helped China develop, now can use that face recognition technology and the video surveillance cameras to track where everybody is at any given time. So if you're jaywalking in Beijing, the video surveillance camera catches you walking illegally across the street, face recognition identifies you, artificial intelligence automatically deducts the fine from your bank account without human intervention. And of course, we all know everybody's carrying their phones around with them, and the phones are tracked by the Chinese government. They know where you go, what you buy. They know who you associate with, what you talk about, what websites you visit. They know whether you've downloaded the Xi Jinping app on your phone and whether or not you're supposed to be and are reading the daily quote from Xi Jinping, China's dear leader, that you have to read his works every day in order to stay in the good graces of the social credit system. And, if your social credit score is high, well, all doors are open to you. You can fly on a plane from Beijing to Chengdu. You can take a high-speed rail wherever you want in the country. You can apply for a passport and an exit visa and maybe travel abroad if you've got a high social credit score. On the other hand, if you've got a low social credit score, the doors are all closed. You can't ride that high-speed rail. You have to take the slow train, which means it's days before you get from Beijing to Chengdu. You can't ride on a plane at all. You can't get an exit visa. You can't get a passport. You can't get a low interest rate loan to buy a home or car. And of course, if your social credit score drops too low, then the police come and knock on your door and may want to send you for re-education. So the social credit score is really a political credit score. And it just underlines the fact that everybody in China today is now living in a high-tech digital dictatorship, with geofencing around them. In the same way you put a geofence around a dog so that he doesn't stray too far from your yard, everybody in China has a geofence around them. So if they stray too far from the party's doctrine and dogma, they're punished for wandering too far afield. So the walls are literally closing in. The walls may be invisible, but they're closing in on the Chinese people. It is, as I say, a giant prison camp. The Communist Party has enslaved 1/7 of humanity, and quite frankly, lusts to enslave the rest of us as well.
Once again, just heartbreaking. Let's close on this note. We know that religious minorities, and especially Christians in China, as you have pointed out, they've had to endure years of persecution and oppression under the communist regime. Of course, Catholics as well. And some people have been critical of the Vatican-China Accord, which seems to have emboldened the communist government to crack down even more on Catholics. What would your advice be to suffering Christians in China in these days of persecution?
Well, there is a chapter in The Devil in Communist China about the persecution of religious groups in China, focusing primarily on the Catholics because I'm Catholic and that's a particular concern of mine. And Catholics have had a target on their back from the very beginning, because Mao said during the days of the Civil War that Catholic missionaries were terrorists and deserved to be eliminated. He had a particular hatred for Catholics because Catholics, he thought, were disloyal. Their loyalties lie, were primarily with God and with a foreign power, which is how he regarded the Vatican in those days. And so the Communist Party has always gone to great lengths to try to stamp out the Catholic faith. Sadly, in 2018, the Vatican signed an agreement, we call it the Sino-Vatican Agreement, between China and the Vatican. Now, we don't know the terms of that agreement because it's still secret, but we understand that it concerns the appointment of bishops. Now, I had the privilege of sitting down with Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Cardinal Secretary of State, in June of 2018. I spent an hour with him, explaining to him the persecution that Catholics had endured over the last 50 years of communist rule, and how any agreement would not create a safe space for Catholics in China. I told him instead it would enable the Communist Party to tighten its controls over the church even more tightly. And that's sadly exactly what has happened. The agreement may concern the appointment of bishops, but what it has been used for in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, which lies about the contents of the agreement, it's been used to tell priests and bishops and lay Catholics in China that they must join the Catholic Patriotic Association because the Vatican has told them to. Well, my understanding is the agreement says no such thing, but because it's secret, it's hard to contest that when bishops and priests and laity in China are put under pressure. And the other thing is the Vatican has not spoken out in their defense. One underground bishop said recently, he said, in the past, we've suffered terrible persecution at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. But even under persecution, we always knew that we had the support of the Vatican. He said, now we're no longer sure that we do. What a situation to be in for the Vatican to have signed an agreement that, in my view, and in the view of Cardinal Zen and others, sells out the underground church, gives the initiative to the Chinese Communist Party concerning the appointment of bishops, and has now been blatantly violated by the Chinese Communist Party by recently appointing a new bishop of Shanghai without even consulting the Vatican, which, after 6 months of embarrassed silence, said, okay, we accept your candidate for Bishop of Shanghai. The Pope recognizes him because we don't want the flock to be without a shepherd. Well, that wasn't the way the Vatican agreement with China was supposed to work. They were supposed to allow the Communist Party to advance the name of a potential bishop. The Vatican was supposed to have a veto over that. And if it vetoed that candidate, then the Communist Party would come up with another candidate. Now, that's not ideal. But even that temporary veto on the part of the Vatican has now been ignored by the Chinese Communist Party as it controls, co-opts, and gradually tries to crush the life out of the Catholic Church in China.
It's, again, just so tragic. I mean, you make a deal with the devil and you expect the devil to stick to its terms. That's just not going to happen.
I didn't say exactly that, but I made it clear to Cardinal Parolin and the Communist Party would violate the agreement before the ink was dry on the paper. They would misrepresent it to the Chinese people, and that it would harm, not help the church in China. And at the end, I mean, God love him, he listened for an hour in apparent sympathy. And then at the end, of course, my heart sank because he said, well, the agreement's already negotiated. We're just waiting for the Chinese side to sign it. Okay. Well, it's a done deal. It was negotiated by former Cardinal McCarrick, by the way. So it can't be good.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Yours is such an important voice in bringing to light not only the suffering of the Chinese people, but also the dangers of communism and its spread, potentially here in the U.S. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me. And I hope that anyone who's interested in China can get a copy of The Devil and Communist China, because that will tell you everything you need to know about the threat that we face.
Yes. Again, the book is titled The Devil and Communist China. You can buy it from 10 publishers. And please remember to pray for the people of China. They might be halfway across the world, but they are our brothers and sisters in Christ. They're suffering and they need our prayers. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. And in the words of Saint Joan of Arc, in God's name, forward, boldly.